Hi, thank you so much for watching the youth program volunteer training and taking some time to learn about Syrian Community Network before you come work with our summer program. As I mentioned in my email, usually this program, or excuse me, this training is completed in person, but because we know that summer schedules can be hectic and our own schedule at the office has been very hectic, we decided to create a video and short response for everyone that is new to our organization to complete prior to joining our summer program this year. So first of all, I just wanted to give some introductions. So my name is Emily Kane. I am the education director at Syrian Community Network. I've been with the organization since last fall and helped launch the after school program and really get the youth program to the place that it currently is at. We're still doing a lot of building in a lot of ways, which I'll talk about a little bit later. I also I also wanted to talk about our recent hire, Amanda, who is our youth coordinator. She was actually a longtime volunteer with the youth program and recently joined the team full time to support the youth program and do some administrative work with our executive director as well. So we kind of make up this team and we've planned the summer program, and likely you have heard from one of us in the last few weeks regarding kind of details about what to expect this summer. So I want to go over our training topics and kind of talk about what you can expect as we go through the different just topics that we need to talk about before you come to our space. So the first topic is refugee resettlement. We really believe that all of our volunteers should have at least a basic understanding of what our families have experienced in order to get to Chicago. We also think it's really important, given all of the false narratives and rhetoric swarming the media and online community, that you really understand what does and does not happen within refugee resettlement so that you can help us kind of set the record straight when folks might be misinformed. The second thing that we'll go over is just the youth program in general. We'll talk about kind of where the youth program has been and what the youth program hopefully will be. You might have heard we're in the process of moving to a new space. We're currently in a temporary office, so there's really a lot of things in the next couple of months that will change for our youth program, and we're very excited about that. And then three will actually be our final topic. We're going to talk about what it means to be a trauma-informed volunteer. We have a lot of students that are obviously, we believe, and I'll talk about this a little later, but trauma is ongoing and it's not something that necessarily happens and stops. And so we have a lot of students that are still processing and experiencing trauma in their daily lives. And we're going to talk about what that means and how to create the best possible space for our students and also for you. And then 4, we're not going to do the role-playing scenarios. Obviously, that would be very difficult to do. And so we'll skip that section for this particular training. So the first thing that I kind of want to go over is the definition and just answer to the question, who are refugees? So as you can read, a refugee is any person from outside the boundaries of his or her nation state who is unable or unwilling to return because of a well-founded fear of persecution based on religion, ethnicity, race, group membership, or political opinion. There are estimated 65 million people in the world who are displaced and may be considered refugees. This is actually the UNHCR definition. It's pulled right from their website, and it's the definition that we recognize here at SCN. So we also want to talk about what is resettlement. So resettlement is a process for the most vulnerable people who are unable to return to their home country. The UNHCR will screen for resettlement into an accepting country. So this process will exclude anyone who has committed serious crimes or who has the opportunity to return to their home country. So that's something that they'll consider. refugees do not choose their country of resettlement, so that's something that we definitely want to clarify. The UNHCR decides for them. So while a family might prefer to come to the United States, they could very well end up going to Germany or vice versa. Less than 1% of refugees are resettled into one of 34 nations currently accepting refugees. That number is incredibly small, and as you probably know, is really, really decreased within the United States specifically. The United States resettled 45,000 refugees in 2018, and actually that number is not even correct. As I'm reading it, I'm realizing that that was the number that was like the cap, that was the most people, and we didn't even come close to 45,000, which even 45,000, even if we had hit that number, that would have been a sharp decline from previous years with the Obama administration. But since the new administration has taken office, that number, the 45,000 number, has not even close. We have not even come close to resettling that many people in the United States. We're also going to kind of shift and talk a little bit about who is resettled in the United States and what those numbers look like. So resettled refugees come from 70 different countries, but mostly in the United States from Syria, the DRC, and Myanmar. And then here's just a graphic to kind of take a peek at to really see those numbers broken down a little bit. This is reflective of 2018. So now I want to talk a little bit about the process of resettlement in the United States and what that kind of looks like. This is going to be incredibly brief. There could be days and days of training just on this particular topic, but we're going to keep it pretty concise so that you know at least the basics of what a family and what our families have likely gone through in order to arrive in Chicago. So after the process of the screening process that the UNHCR will complete and a family is referred to the United States, the United States government will do many different separate security screening processes, which will include 8 government agencies, 5 different background checks, 6 database clearances, and then 3 in-person interviews. This process often takes up to 2 years before a family enters the United States. So when families get a call or receive word that they are being referred to the United States, that process after that phone call, it will likely take them up to 18 months to 2 years to even set foot in the United States after that phone call. And then, so once cleared through that process, the State Department assigns the family to one of the NGOs in the U.S. for resettlement into their new community. So here in Chicago, we have some really large nonprofits that do the majority of the resettlement in the state of Illinois. We have Refugee One, we have World Relief, we have Heartland Alliance, we have Catholic Charities. Those are all really large resettlement agencies, and some of those are not just in Chicago. Some of those are actually nationwide and have different spots in different cities, and some of them are just local to Chicago. And then I just want to note that the top U.S. states for resettlement are California, Texas, New York, Washington, and Ohio. Illinois ranks 9th as of 2018 and resettled 1,100 refugees in 2017, with Myanmar as the most represented country of origin. I also just want to note that obviously this data is a little bit backlogged, and I am curious in the last few years how the state rankings will shift, given some of just the different shifts in policies that different states have taken. And so it'll be interesting to see what those numbers, if those numbers or the top states stay the same, or if there's going to be some shifting. So I now kind of want to shift briefly to what does SCN do. You can read our mission right at the top. It is to empower Syrian refugees in achieving a seamless transition and relocation to the United States through connecting people to the right services and support networks. our overall goals. We want to partner with refugee resettlement agencies like the ones I just listed in the previous slide or just connect with them and be kind of collaborative partners in supporting newly arrived Syrian refugees. We want to connect Syrian refugees with the appropriate services and community resources available. We want to foster a relationship between Syrian refugees and then also the local Chicago community. And then establish cultural competency for staff working with Syrian refugees as well as for Syrians who need to learn about their new culture in the United States. So there's a lot of working on cultural competency on both ends, which is really, really important. So I now kind of want to shift into the youth program overview. I want to talk a little bit about, what we do in the youth program and kind of just how it came to be and what the timeline is. We're going to talk a little bit about your role, although a more specific conversation will likely come more individually with either myself or Amanda in the next week or so. And then we're going to talk about challenging behaviors within this as well. And then this isn't included because of the role that you have as a volunteer, but when we go over the tutoring and after school, we do tips and tactics for ELL students as well. That's not something we're going to focus on in this particular training, and I should have taken that out, but I will probably send it your way just so you have it. I think it's helpful information when you're working with students. Really any students, it can be really, really helpful in guiding just lesson planning, especially if you're a workshop leader. So I want to start by kind of talking about the after school program. The after school program started full time and really in the formal way that it is today in September of 2018. The after school program provides a safe space for SEN students to build academic, creative, and social emotional skills. Last year, we met Monday through Thursday at, it says we met at the SEN office, but we actually ended up moving around a little bit because our program grew and our needs changed from our small office to needing a space. We actually met in a church across the street for a while, and then finally we moved to Sullivan High School. And we were there for a while, but then we actually had an office fire in March and had a temporary office space, which is actually where the summer programming still is. We have not been able to move back into our space. And so we have been we all moved to Edgewater Presbyterian at 1020 West Bryn Mawr, which is again where you will be coming, and we've been here since. So it is really nice to be all together in the same space again, and we will all move back together in hopefully early fall. Anyway, so that is where after school met for the remainder of last school year. We met from, usually students would arrive 3:30-ish and they would leave right before 6 o'clock. We actually had drivers that would pick them up to and from school, pick them up from school and bring them here and then also bring them home. And so parents didn't have to worry about transportation. It was something that we covered. Last year, the program was a little smaller and we designed it for pre-K to third grade next year because Amanda has been hired and we'll have a bigger, hopefully a bigger volunteer pool as well. We're looking to expand the age group to at least upper elementary. And then some things we worked on, you'll see a picture here. They were doing some literacy SWAT game. So they were working on different consonant sounds. And then, so that's just an example of maybe some of the academic support we might do. We also do homework support. We have one-on-one tutoring often in this space. We do social emotional learning in the space, whether that might be through art or a physical activity. And then we also do a lot of play. We have a lot of different games and just manipulatives for students to build if they prefer to be by themselves. Sometimes students just want to read a book with a volunteer and just really sit and relax and enjoy someone reading to them. It really was often the student's choice. And then on top of all of that, one thing that we also had here at Edgewater Presbyterian is a very large gym where the students would get to have some physical activity after school too, which is obviously really important. And we were really grateful for that space. The other thing that I oversee is the tutoring program. So our tutoring program seeks to enhance the academic skills and confidence of SEN students through individualized volunteer tutoring. And so this is what we did for our older students that were struggling. We would put them with a volunteer tutor that would meet with them 1 or 2 times a week, where it depended. Sometimes they would meet in the office, sometimes students would meet in the homes with their tutor. I would say that a lot of tutors did primarily homework support, but we did have tutors that would read novels or bring supplemental materials. Right now, I have a couple of matches that are still working even though it's summer, and I'll send different activities based on the feedback that I get from their teachers. This is their reading level, and then we'll kind of create some activities or find activities that are appropriate for them. And then sometimes it's really just a matter of being a mentor as well. So here is a picture of Omar and Sharif. Sharif became a pretty consistent part of Omar's life. You can see that they're holding some awards that Omar received at the end of the semester. He received the Reading Achievement Award and then also perfect attendance. And they were a really great match last year. So I also kind of want to go over the additional youth program services that we provide. So we have about 15 students in our after school program. We have about a smaller number, like 5 students that are currently matched with the tutor. We have 20 students that are coming to our summer program. But overall, in Chicago, we have about 160 families that we serve. So that leaves a lot of children that are maybe engaged in other activities after school or during the summer, but still need support in other ways. So things that I often do are supporting parents in parent-teacher conferences. I'll meet with teachers, administrators, and other community members about how to best support students if they're struggling. I'll attend IEP meetings, which if you're not familiar, that's individualized education plan meetings for students that have been identified as having a special need. I'll attend report card pickups to assist families with any sort of support and navigation they need there. And then I also just am in general in communication with parents, counselors, and administration at the school via email or phone, and just kind of serve as a liaison between the teacher and parent. While I don't speak Arabic, I was a traditional teacher by trade before moving into the nonprofit sector. And so there's a lot of lingo and language that teachers can throw around that I can kind of pass on to our Arabic speaking staff, and then we can communicate with the family. So it really is just kind of a team effort. Another thing that we often do is make referrals for mental health services or resources. We make sure that students have the materials that they need for school. We'll do a backpack drive at the end of the summer, school supplies, making sure that those things are covered. And then another thing that I do that's kind of separate from all of those items is that sometimes I'll go into classrooms that maybe are from outside of the refugee community or aren't familiar with the process and talk to them about what we do and why. So a little bit of kind of what I'm doing here in this training, but more specifically for younger students that have a teacher that will bring us in. So I'm going to go over the summer program briefly because, as I said, there will likely be a specific conversation because some of you guys watching this are workshop leaders and you'll have a different role than the volunteer support staff. And so rather than make you listen to both, we'll kind of split up and you've likely received an email from myself or from Amanda setting up that conversation. But just to give you a general sense of what the summer program will be. So the summer program is July 8th through July 31st. Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. We meet, as I said, at our church, or not our church, but at Edgewater Presbyterian, the church where our office is at 1020 West Bryn Mawr. And the program is going to be 2.5 hours. So we'll start with an hour activity. So if you're a workshop leader, you'll run an activity for an hour. If you're a volunteer, you will likely be assigned to a group of students, and you will travel with them throughout the day. So we have 1 hour activity, then we're going to break for snack, and then we'll have our final activity from 3:30 to 4:30. Activities include lots of different things. We have 2 different activities each day. So let's see if I can do this by memory. So Mondays are literacy in actually both Arabic and in English. Tuesdays, we are doing movement and so just different dance and movement activities, as well as art, and then occasionally art therapy. And then on Wednesdays, we have music class, and then we'll be doing some physical literacy activities. So we'll be doing some just different kinds of relay races and learning and reading activities, but we'll be doing it in the gym. So it'll have a little bit of a twist on it in terms of not your typical literacy setting. So we're pretty excited to make that learning a little bit more engaging and fun for students. So that's kind of what that will look like. We also have some one-off sessions. We have maybe a computer literacy or computer programming session for our older students. We're pairing with another community organization and perhaps doing a reading day, a reading buddy day. And so all of the schedules will be posted when you arrive, and likely if you have committed to the same day each week, it will actually stay the same each week. But if something will change, that'll be something that's communicated. And then in terms of transportation, students receive a bus pass, as well as their parents, or the accompanying parent will also receive a bus pass. That bus pass is actually unlimited for the entire week. So it will assist them in getting to the program, but they also just get to use the bus money for any life need that they might have, which is really great. And then we'll also offer gas cards too for families that don't take the bus and prefer to drive instead. So something that I want to talk about as we kind of transition into the next section of our training is preventing challenging behavior. We have really, really incredible and wonderful students that attend our program, but we definitely have our share of challenges with just bringing a room full of students that are all processing a lot of change and emotion all at the same time together. There can definitely be some challenging days. And so these are some things that we think about and really, really try to adhere to. And I want to share them with you just so that you kind of know sort of our vision when we're planning something or we're thinking about a day. So the first thing is that there are clear directions and expectations. So we want to make sure that students really understand what is being expected of them, and that they understand literally what the direction is. Oftentimes, there might be a student that's off task, and it's really because they just don't understand or didn't understand what I said. I wasn't clear enough, or I didn't make sure that everyone was listening, and it was chaotic. And so just something as simply as making sure that we're being clear can go a really, really long way. In the same vein, we really want to be consistent. So in the after school program, for example, students knew what to expect when they walked through the door. They knew which room they would be going into first and which room they would be going into last in terms of activities. And that really, really helped keep the safe space, but then also just like provide students with autonomy over their own learning, so they knew kind of what to expect. Excuse me. And that kind of autonomy over their own learning kind of goes into the third one, which is we really like to provide student choices. So what I mean by that is that in the after school program or in the summer program, we might let students decide, okay, we're in the literacy workshop with Miss Emily, and you can either go to this table and do this activity or go to this table and do this activity, and it's up to you. Likely my objectives for the activity will be really similar, but the way in which you get to an objective might look a little different based on what students prefer. And giving students choice really, it just allows, everyone likes to have choices, right? No one likes to be told this is what you're doing and you don't have any other options, especially when this is an elected program that they're attending. We want to make sure that it's something that they feel good about too, and that their voice is involved. The fourth thing is positive narration. So you will likely over the summer hear me positively narrating students that are doing what has been asked of them. So if I might raise my hand, which signals to students that they're to stop talking and turn and pay attention to whoever is leading the group, I might positively say, I have Adam's eyes and ears. Rimas is listening. Thank you, Tahani. Thank you, Fatima. I might just simply do that. And that is just a more positive and effective way I have found than pulling out students that are maybe doing the opposite of what I would hope them to be doing. Because then students typically look around and be like, oh, I'm supposed to be doing X, Y, Z, and they'll join in with the group. We really try to avoid surprises here at SCN, not necessarily fun surprises, but perhaps maybe the gym is closed and we know that the gym is going to be closed. That might be something that we tell students the day before so they know when they get there, their gym time might not happen because another group is there. That's just an example of something that can help avoid meltdowns or just students becoming dysregulated because what they expected isn't what is happening. Obviously, we want to make everything fun at after school and at our summer program. And so that is a huge part of what we do. We chose activities that the kids have expressed interest in, and we're really excited for the workshop leaders and the volunteers to take part in that. And then the other thing is kind of teaching the why. I think particularly if students are in a conflict or a student has really been kind of off task or behaving in a way that might be hurtful to somebody else, we really want to have a conversation about why that might not be something we want in our space. What do we want our community to look like? How do we want community members to act? These are all conversations that we have rather than just saying, hey, you shouldn't do that. We really want to be clear about why. Why is it important that we adhere to certain norms when we're in our community room and in our space? So sometimes we can try to prevent challenging behavior and we can put things in place to make sure that it doesn't happen, but inevitably it will happen. Oftentimes it happens in a space where two students are maybe not getting along with one another. And so these are kind of the steps that Amanda and I follow and that the students actually know to follow as well. And I'll kind of talk about that as we go through them. So 1 and 2 are really not so much on the student as they are on the instructor or volunteer. So the first thing that we want to do is respond calmly with a redirection. We want to make sure we're being really clear about what the expectation is if they're not living up to the expectation. So kind of like I said in the last slide, sometimes things can really be resolved when you just ask a student, hey, do you know what you're supposed to be doing right now? Or what did Miss Emily just say to do? And maybe they just literally have no idea. And so that that is one way to solve the problem. Maybe they do know and they don't want to be doing it. And that's where number 2 can come in. So that's where we think about offering choices. We're really lucky that at our after school program and at our summer program, we'll be able to offer choices within the expectation. So maybe a student wants to read a different book or they want to play a different game in the gym, etc. And so those are definitely things that we can work with because we're in a really flexible space that we get to create ourselves. And then 3 and 4 are both items where things just continue to escalate. You've tried to offer choices, you've tried to redirect, and this is where a staff member really should be involved because we don't want to leave it up to a volunteer to have to feel like they have to sort of navigate some of the harder conversations with students. And that doesn't mean that we don't want you present in part of it, but we definitely want you to feel supported in those situations. And so that's where you might say, you know what, we might need to take a break in the hall, or we might need to go for a walk, especially if two students are kind of fighting with one another, whether that be verbally, and then especially if it ends up being physically, we definitely want to take a break and change the setting. And then as it says, this step requires communication with myself or Amanda to make sure that we're just aware of, first of all, that something took place, and then also that we know where students are at all times. And then number 4 says discuss alternative behaviors after there has been time to cool off. And this will be led by Emily or Amanda. Ideally, actually, this will be led by the student, and it will be with myself or Amanda, and then another student if another student is involved. And how that looks is we usually have students take a break from one another. We make sure that, first of all, that's something they feel good about. Sometimes students just want to kind of parse out what happened right away, and that's okay as well, but we let students decide how they're feeling. And they might say, okay, I'm ready to talk right now. And then we'll have 2 students that were not getting along have to listen to the other student about what happened. So student A might say what happened, and then student B is listening. And then I always make sure that student B can paraphrase what student A said. Even if they don't agree with the rendition of the story, I really want to make sure that student B is listening to what student A is saying. And then we flip that, right? And we do the opposite so that both students are able to paraphrase and repeat back what they heard from the other student. And then finally, their last step, it's step 3 on a board that we use in the classroom. Step 3 is repair. So we have students talk about, well, what do we need to do to fix what happened and also prevent things from happening in the future? And so, like I said, steps 3 and 4, that was a lot of information I just gave you. Steps 3 and 4 really will be led by myself or Amanda, but I always think it's helpful if a volunteer is present in the conversation or just observing the conversation if it was the volunteer that actually observed the issue that took place. I think it's helpful to have a team of people there. And so while you might be involved in one of those conversations or just conflict resolution situations, it won't be you that has to kind of lead that process. So we're going to end kind of going over a little bit of what I just talked about, but giving a little bit of a background of trauma-informed volunteering. This particular section was actually written by Matthew Parsons. He was a social work intern here from UChicago, and he has actually since moved on to another placement, but this was something that he did some research on and really helped us kind of formulate how to communicate this with volunteers after he spent some time. Actually, he spent a tremendous amount of time Tuesdays and Thursdays every day in the center with me. So this is his piece, but I'm just going to kind of go through it and talk about what he wrote, and we can kind of go from there. So the first thing that we have is, answering this question, what is trauma? So this is a word that is thrown around a lot, and I think it's important that we talk about what it is. And so in the beginning of the training, I talked about how we really view trauma as an ongoing, it's linear, right? It's an event or a series of events, more likely, or even a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. And then we also know that trauma has lasting adverse effects on the functioning of an individual, whether that be mental, physical, or social, emotional, or a spiritual well-being. We also want to kind of just talk about risk factors when we're thinking about what is trauma or how does trauma come about. So we know that all of these listed, so I'm not going to read them to you. You can read them. But what we talk about a lot here in our space is that the refugee experience engages with a lot of these risk factors. So if you look, a lack of control, there might have been potential traumatic experiences in a home country, and then in transit, there's chronic stress of just, going through the resettlement process, but then also moving to Chicago, and then now what? Having to totally rebuild a life. Kids definitely feel that stress and definitely experience it, right, as well. So it's kind of both feeling that maybe from parents or family members or community members, but then also engaging with that stress themselves as they enter a new school system. And then another common theme to kind of talk about here is that the refugee experience disrupts relationships between individuals and their families, between individuals and their nation, and then also then within families again, right, with oneself as one attempts, or excuse me, and then also within oneself as one attempts to acculturate into a new place. So all of these things are things that our students are experiencing or that their parents are experiencing, on top of, you know, some of the other things that are listed of social isolation when there's a language barrier. It's very common for that to be an experience. Um, and then some other things that we're just going to talk about is kind of the complexity of trauma and what that how that plays a role in creating the best space that we can at our youth program. So as we transition from the last slide, I want to talk about some of the protective factors that we think about just as a youth program, but also as an organization. So where trauma is concerned, our focus is in the first factor, particularly in the youth program, which is to bolster social support. We know and believe that healing happens in relationships. And so we really want to make sure that our students feel like they're cared for by us, that they're listened to by us. I always tell tutors that, you know, we're really not going to have a successful match or have students that feel like they're ready to learn if they don't feel like you care about them or know them. And so really the first few sessions in a tutoring match are often just getting to know one another, because that is the most important step. Nothing else is going to matter. Multiplication facts are not going to matter if they don't feel comfortable and supported by their tutor. And this really goes for any volunteer in our space. You can probably think back to the good and bad teachers that you've had in your life and be like, oh yeah, the teacher that was really an awful teacher, I don't really feel like they cared about me, and I didn't give them my attention because of that. I think we can all identify with people or leaders in our youth where that really felt like kind of how it was, and have a negative experience with that. That all being said, we also want to name, and I think it's really important to say that we're not therapists. I am not a licensed therapist. Our job is not to understand their trauma or to even explore it with them. Our job is to create and foster an unconditionally loving and positive relationship with the kids, and make sure that that it's a place where healing can happen, right? But again, that does not mean that we're exploring trauma with students, and we feel very strongly about that. We're actually going to talk a little bit more about that and avoiding how we might trigger trauma in the next couple of slides. But then some other things that are really important. Obviously, we want students to have a strong connection with their caregiver. And that really comes when we think about holistically supporting a family. We want to support their caregiver too, right? Like their parents, their siblings, their aunties, their uncles, anyone within their community. Because when a piece of the family might be struggling or hurting, it's going to affect the other family members. And that sort of leads into the next two, which is socioeconomic stability and access to healthcare. These are both themes that our case managers work through every single day, all day. And that's really where that holistic approach comes along, because if we know a student is feeling stress because a parent is feeling stress, we want to figure out what that stress is being caused by, and see if there's a way that we can support that. Okay, so we also want to just talk a little bit about understanding the signs that could potentially point to trauma in order to respond appropriately. So broadly speaking, we know that trauma engages the fight, flight, or freeze response. So students' memories may be affected, and language centers of the brain can be turned off. So when a student might be triggered, so when kids or even adults, right, who have experienced trauma are re-triggered, they might react from their brain stem rather than their thinking brain, meaning they're thinking about a past experience and reacting from that, whether that's consciously or not. So in these moments, we really want to be able to listen to what their behaviors are telling us. Sometimes it's really futile to try and talk them out of a trauma response because, like, neurobiologically, they cannot access the thinking or talking part of their brain. So if you're someone that experiences anxiety, for example, you might identify with this, right? Or it's likely we have all experienced trauma in some way. And so this might be something that you're like, yeah, you're right. When I'm going through that experience, I'm not listening to anyone around me. And so that's really important to kind of name and think about so that we're not just dismissing and trying to talk kids out of their trauma. So some of these behaviors, irritability, being easily startled, problems concentrating, trouble sleeping, all of these you can keep reading, disassociation. These behaviors can be kind of confusing, right? Because it's also important to remember that some of these behaviors are just characteristics of childhood. So you can have trouble concentrating, right? Or you can be irritable or even easily startled and not necessarily being re-triggered by a traumatic experience. So that can be a little bit tricky. And so to clarify, what we're really talking about here is an excessive problem or behaviors that are out of the normal range for that particular student. It is not necessarily something that you're going to know right away. Maybe a student is acting very different from how they usually act, and you know because you've spent 6 months with a student for an entire, once a week, and you're going to get to know that student and know what their common behaviors are. We also want to just say that it's really important to recognize these behaviors, not to diagnose, but to really just keep yourself in check. So some of these behaviors can be kind of frustrating as a teacher or a volunteer, and you might notice an impulse to really control what is happening. Or you might just be frustrated, right? So we want to remember that these behaviors aren't in the control of the child who has experienced trauma, and that the best thing that you can do is you yourself to stay regulated and to respond calmly. Another thing that we just wanted to note is that a lot of these top behaviors, irritability, easily being startled, problems concentrating, sitting still, they're often misdiagnosed as ADHD. Which is something that we have seen happen here just anecdotally. And then I think, yep, there's one more part. So we also just, some thoughts are, so we talked about behaviors, but some thoughts or beliefs might be that you're hearing persistent negative beliefs about the world from the student, persistent negative emotions, feeling alienated. These are things that you might want to look or might just want to notice. I think one thing that I always appreciated or a comment when I was in a training once is that we don't necessarily need to think about these behaviors in as something to solve or something to fix, which we kind of talked about at the beginning of this slide in thinking about it's not necessarily your job to control the student's feelings, right? And sometimes when we're in charge of a classroom or we're trying to get a group of kids to work together to do something, that can be your reaction. It can be your response. It's natural. But it's really important to rather think about these different behaviors and reactions as data points and thinking about it's another way to get to know what is going on with the student and collecting those data points. Okay, I know that when we're in this activity, it's really hard for student A to do this. And so I'm going to put that in my database for that student and know to be prepared for that the next time or to come up with an alternative for that student. I always thought that was really helpful to think about rather than a very clear-cut response, right? Because it's really just not that simple. So I want to talk about some general guidelines, and I also just want to note that this is something that we talk about within the After School Center, and I think these guidelines really sort of align in that space where there are more choices and less kind of group activities, there's autonomy to kind of choose. And not that that won't happen during the summer, because it will, but there will be workshop leaders and there will be group activities in a way that doesn't happen day to day in the after school center necessarily. So just kind of take these with a grain of salt, because I think some of them will make sense in that space and some of them will be maybe just need to be altered a little bit. So either way, we know that when you're first meeting a child, we would like you to introduce yourself. We want you to ask their name. We want you to remember it. We want you to get to know them. These are all things that are going to happen over time, right? So really establishing that connection, and creating that mutual respect. We want you to approach the child as a full partner and decision maker. So again, this is something that we really stress when we're talking about the after school center, because there are so many options and students kind of get to decide where their learning takes them that day. And while summer might be set up a little different, I still think that it's important to remember that our students have a lot to teach us too. And so we want to make sure that they know that we know that, right? That we feel like, hey, you're also a teacher. And so making them feel like that in the classroom, whether that be on an individual basis or on a group basis, is really, really imperative. We want to be consistent and give reasonable consequences. So this is something that's really more geared for staff, and there will always be a staff member in the room, but I think it's important to name. It's something that we really focus on and talk a lot about because it's complicated, and so I think it's important to name. And then I already kind of talked about this, but we want to receive behavior points as data, not necessarily as things to fix in the moment. And then the last one really is for after school, and that we recognize the importance of play. And so they say we practice playing a lot in the after school center, and that will happen too at summer as well, as practicing playing together and figuring out conflict resolution and processing emotions with a peer. Those are all really, really important parts of childhood development, and it's something we value here at SCN. So one of the things that we want to talk about is what do we do if a child becomes dysregulated? We're noticing some of the behaviors that we've talked about in previous slides. What do I do? And so I think the first thing is to really just make sure that the child knows that you're there for them and that you're present, even if that just means sitting next to them and not talking. Sometimes that can be the most powerful thing, is to just not leave, right? Some things that you might say is, I can tell that you're really mad, or if XYZ happened to me, I'd be sad too. Really concentrate on validating their feelings. If they're really not communicating with you, that's okay. Just maintain the connection by being present and not leaving. This says if you have to leave to go get myself or Amanda, find someone who can stand in for you. In the case of summer, it will be unlikely that you're in a space where a staff member isn't present. And so really just make sure that you make eye contact with myself or Amanda, and that we can come and sort of support the student, or maybe take the student into a space where they can process emotions in a more private setting. Sometimes what we encourage students to do, and I think this is helpful for volunteers to know in case this, it's just nice to have this in your back pocket, is to do something physical or repetitive. So you might go on a walk with a student. I have a student that works really, really well with tossing a ball back and forth, and it really helps to regulate that student. We might play patty cake with a student, which might sound a little bit silly, but that physical or repetitive, the repetitiveness of that can help bring a student back to the present space. And then another, if the physical aspect is not something that feels like it's going to work, you might do 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, which is tell me 5 things you see, 4 things you hear, 3 things you smell, etc. Or you might play the game I Spy, really to get them back to the present. So we also just kind of want to talk about, what do we do if a child reveals part of their trauma history with you? First of all, this likely means that the student trusts you and that you're in a place with a student where they really believe that you care about them. And so it's definitely not a bad thing that this happens, and we want to say that. some guidelines though when we're thinking about that is we don't want to assume anything. We don't want to probe. Like we've mentioned a couple times, we're not therapists here at SCN, and we take that very seriously. It's not our job to walk students through trauma and to process it with them, but it is our jobs, right, to listen thoughtfully and to be there for them. You might respond with sympathy, saying, "I'm sorry that happened to you," or a statement, a very simple statement like that. As we talked before, staying with the child is really important as they're processing those emotions. I think one thing that is tricky because it's just a natural instinct is that it's really, really, really not our jobs to fix what has happened. Because if we're being realistic, it's probably not something you can fix, and that's okay. And so, really, just naming like, I'm so upset for you. I would be upset if I were you too. Just validating is really, really important, and not necessarily trying to like solve a problem with a student when you really don't have the means to be able to solve a problem. We are mandatory reporters. I'm a mandatory reporter. Amanda's a mandatory reporter. Our case management teams, they're all mandatory reporters. And so if a child reveals an incident of physical or sexual abuse, you absolutely have to tell Emily. You can also disclose it to Amanda, and she will bring it to me, but explain to the child that in order to keep them safe, that it's something that you're going to have to pass along if they ask you to keep it a secret. I always tell students I can keep your secrets unless I think that you're not safe or that you're being hurt. And so that's something that I usually state in a situation when it's necessary. It's not something that I say ahead of time. Okay, we're going. And then the last one of the last things we want to talk about is that if you make a mistake with a student, and particularly if you're volunteering with us for a long time, it's definitely going to happen, and that's okay. So you might get frustrated with a student, you might try to redirect them in a way that probably isn't fair. And so we really just want to make sure that we say, I'm sorry. We want to be specific about what we're sorry for. We want to empathize with the student, and then we want to say we're sorry again. I think it's a really, really big deal when adults say sorry to kids. It models something that I don't think kids get to see a lot, and that's really unfortunate because we all make mistakes, including adults. If you're kind of like, what would I make a mistake on? I feel confused by this slide. I just want to kind of give an example of something that happened where I ended up needing to say sorry to a student. So I'd had a really hectic day at the after school program. I didn't have a lot of volunteers, and things sort of ended up getting a little bit out of control at the end. And I had a student that kept asking me for a computer for their homework. But I really, in that moment, it was just not a priority, unfortunately, that to go downstairs and get the student a computer. And I snapped at the student and said, I need you to wait. And that's all I said, but it was the tone that I used. And it was completely unfair because the student hadn't done anything wrong. And I was reflecting on that later. And I decided to call the student, which is not something that you would be able to do, but the next day or the next time you see them, I don't think it's ever too late to apologize. But I called that student and I said, I was very specific. I said, do you remember when I said this to you at the end of the day when you needed a computer? And she said, yeah, I do. And I said, it was really unfair of me to be frustrated and mad at you because you didn't do anything wrong. So I'm sorry that it probably felt like I wasn't being very nice. And the student was really maybe first of all confused about why I was apologizing, not because I didn't need to say I'm sorry, but probably because her teachers maybe don't say sorry to her a lot. And so even when it's warranted. And so that's just a practice that we think is really important here to make sure that we check ourselves as adults, because just because we're the adults doesn't mean that we are always right or that we're not making mistakes that could be hurtful to students. Okay, so the final slide is really just sort of assigning a little tiny bit of homework to you. So obviously, as I mentioned, usually this training is done in person. It's definitely how I prefer it to be because then we can answer any questions that you have, and it can be really more of a back and forth conversation. I actually think some of you watching this probably have incredible experience and are experts in some of the fields that we've talked about, and it's always great to have those folks in the room. But that being said, because that wasn't possible for this particular training or our quarterly training for the summer, if you could please email me just so that I know that you engaged with this material and that you're prepared to come and work with our students. I'd like you to tell me 3 things that you learned from the training, 2 questions that you have about SCN, whether it be about the youth program or about our origin story or really anything that is still lingering in your mind. And then 1 thing that you hope to learn more about while working with us. What is it that you hope to kind of take away from this experience? So again, thank you so much. We're just under an hour. So I hope that this has felt helpful to you. If you do have any questions, you certainly don't just have to list 2. So definitely feel free to reach out. And then, as I said, Amanda or myself likely will set up a conversation with you, or you have already talked with us about the specific roles that you might have in the program this summer. So thank you so much.